Okay, today my guest is Professor John Childs. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about John as a person, Professor Child as a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I will skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. John is a fellow of the Academy of Management and the AIB. He is also a fellow of the prestigious British Academy. He was awarded Lifetime Achievement Awards by the International Association for Chinese Management Research, the British Academy, and the AIB. He has published over 150 articles and 25 books. He has been the editor-in-chief of Organization Studies and senior editor of Management and Organization Review. He is also an honorary member of the European Group for Organization Studies. Thank you, John, for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So first question, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Well, it's strange because it's more or less the same as two of your previous guests whose videos I've looked at, Peter Buckley and John Cantwell, which is to be a train driver. And when I was quite small, I had the husband of my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, was a retired locomotive driver. And he took me along one day, I think I was about 7 years of age, to the depot in Birmingham, where a lot of these locomotives were housed. And we went on the footplate. And he actually let me pull the levers to get this great monster going. And this is really thrilling. But I must say, perhaps because I found it rather dirty and hard work, you know, people shoveling coal into the firebox and so on. What I really then decided I wanted to be was a train driver, but an electric train driver, much cleaner. And I love the idea, I think, of having the power to glide sort of effortlessly along a smooth track from place to place. And I still get a thrill from riding on trains. I love to travel on trains and trams. So I think that was my earliest aspiration, to be an electric train driver.
Interesting. Well, what is the point of awareness between domestic versus foreign for you?
Well, I have to mention my mother was German. And so my first introduction to the foreign was when I went with her by train in 1947 to visit my grandparents, who had actually remained in Berlin throughout the war. My mother was married then to my father, living in England, and I was born in England near Manchester. So I don't really remember the wider context. There must have been enormous devastation. That's sort of rather hazy, but I do remember little differences inside my grandmother's house. I was fascinated by the fact that the German system of flushing a toilet was you pressed a valve, and it was so simple. Instead of having to pull a chain and activate a cistern, funny little things like that. And of course, I suppose also at that stage, I realized the big difference in language. I'd not actually learned German because my parents thought, well, if they had a little boy running around speaking German during the war, that would not, they'd all end up being interned. And I've never really overcome that handicap. And then later on in the 50s, I was a schoolboy then, we had family motoring holidays in various continental European countries, sometimes to meet my grandmother. My grandfather had died by that time. And then later on, as a student, every summer holiday, I would go get a student rail ticket, and then which would take me maybe down to Greece or Turkey, and then hitchhike. These particularly student summer trips really did start to give me an awareness of cultural and behavioral and lifestyle differences. Particularly in those days, you tended to be quite often invited into people's homes in Turkey, for example, because the context wasn't spoilt by mass tourism. So I used to go with a friend who studied in a London School of Economics, and I was studying at Cambridge. And so we were still novelties, these young guys from England going around in the sort of backwards of mainly Turkey. We went to Turkey several times. And really people showed us a lot of hospitality. You know, when you went into people's homes and to some extent saw how what they ate and all the rest of it, you really became aware of these different cultural and behavioral differences.
True.
So I think that developed the awareness of the foreign, as it were, in me.
How did you, or when did you choose to be an IB scholar?
Well, I'm going to disappoint you here because I don't think I have ever chosen to be an IB scholar. But what I mean is that I'm not sure I've ever been or ever become a scholar of international business rather than a comparative business scholar, a scholar of comparing business. So, you know, my work's not focused very much on international businesses as such, like MNEs, as holistic organized entities. I have done some work that came out of contact with foreign joint ventures in China. I'll mention my work in China much later on. And so I went to the States on the back of the context and did a little bit of work on headquarters subsidiary relations and particularly control, which activities, which functional activities were controlled by centrally and which ones were given, you know, devolved. But generally speaking, my work has been much more to look at similarities and differences between firms from different countries, how they organize themselves, how they relate to each other, this kind of thing. And this is associated perhaps with my first main research job after my PhD and a couple of years in industry, which is when I worked with what was called the Aston Program of Organizational Studies. And this Aston program, the dominant thinking was that if you had firms and you had public institutions and they faced similar contingencies, which meant size, technology, volatility of the environments they were operating in, then they would come to be structured in similar ways. So what was called the culture-free theory of organization. And I think partly influenced by these earlier travels in Europe, and the fact that in a way I had a bit of a dual identity because, as I say, with a German mother and growing up in Britain, I was never very happy with this kind of strong determinism. And that came out in this strategic choice article I wrote quite early on, which was originally an internal working paper, a critique of the Aston program from within, you know, challenging my colleagues. And it led me to work with somebody called Alfred Kieser, and we started to look at comparisons between British and what was then West German firms. And this indicated some fairly consistent organizational differences, particularly in centralization of decision-making or decentralization, regardless of the contingencies that they face. We sampled our firms to be able to compare firms which had similar contingencies in terms of size and the industries they were in and that sort of thing. And then later on, in the 80s, we are still working with Kieser and with other colleagues from other countries. We compared how the new microelectronic technologies were being applied to service sector work, as various areas, retailing, banking, and hospital work. And again, this showed up quite substantial national differences in in how the technologies were being applied to people's work, whether they're being applied, for example, to narrow down and control work, or whether they're being applied as an aid to actually increase the discretion of workers. And this seemed to be associated with the context, cultural, but particularly institutional, such as whether there was mechanisms for worker participation in making decisions about the design of work systems, applying the new technologies. So a country like Sweden, which was one of the 6 countries we looked at in Europe, was fairly advanced in terms of participation of unions, worker representatives, on the design teams looking, the project teams applying new technology, whereas in a country like Britain, this was largely absent. And the idea, management's idea seemed to be just to consult with technical experts in order to try and control and narrow down and de-skill work, if you like, more. So again, this was throwing up the fact that there were considerable differences, international differences, in the trends, in this case, as to how a new technology was being applied to the field of work, which you could start to understand in terms of the institutional and maybe to some extent cultural context of those different countries. So when I say that a lot of my earlier work, at least, was not so much international business, but international comparisons of business, that's really what I mean.
And that was the foundation, right? That was the foundation of IB for a very long time. If you would like to share something interesting about you that you don't really put on your CV, your CV is pages and pages long. What is something that you would like to share that you do find interesting about your hobbies?
Well, maybe the fact that I have quite a keen interest in music, and I regret never having acquired the technical knowledge to develop that interest, for example, as a player or to learn composition. But while still at school, my classmates, or some of them, and I, we established what was then in the 1950s quite a pioneering society for the appreciation of two composers who later became more popular, but weren't popular at the time. They were late romantics, Bruckner and Mahler. So instead of cultivating girlfriends, particularly during the summer breaks, when we could get together and our parents were away, we had empty houses. We used to listen to gramophone records long into the night, playing these long Bruckner and Mahler symphonies and so on. So I've always had this interest in music. I love listening to music, but I have had a frustration at not ever developing the technical competence to be more active, as a musician, either as a player or even to compose music.
Interesting. Let's talk about regrets. What is one thing you wish you would have done that you didn't?
Well, I suppose it's a bit late now for me to do anything else, but when I look back, my strongest subjects at school were actually in maths and the sciences. But when I got to what we call in the British system, the sixth form, upper grades in high school, if you like, I didn't choose to continue with those subjects. I chose what we call art subjects, history and French and economics and so on, as offering a more likely route for me to get into a good university. The teaching seemed to be much stronger in my particular school, grammar school, at that level in the sixth form. And I've always regretted this. I mean, I got to university and I don't regret that, but it did close off the route to a career that I sometimes think I would have chosen in preference, namely medicine, because at least with medicine, you can clearly see that you can directly improve people's lives. And, from time to time, maybe some other academics think the same way. We wonder, really, what contribution are we actually making to human well-being? Well, if you're a doctor, I don't think, you can see that obviously. So you get that immediate satisfaction from what you're doing. So I have a regret, and if I could have chosen again, and perhaps in different circumstances, I might have stuck to the sort of subjects that would provide a route into medicine, but I didn't. So there we are. That's life.
What are you most passionate about?
What am I what?
Passionate about? What's your passion in?
Well, I think one of the things I'm passionate about, and I think it came about through the kind of university education I was privileged to have, which is at Cambridge, where the undergraduates, the students are very much encouraged to debate and discuss and constructively criticize. So what I'm passionate about is the value of disagreement, professional disagreement, and debate, and confronting and accepting as important different viewpoints to one's own. And I continue to be passionate about this, and it's not always easy in even in universities nowadays, partly because of certain sensitivities, even partly because of so-called political correctness, always to be able to do that. You know, there's a lot of closing off of free debate and speech and respect for other points of view, even though you may really believe those points of view are quite misguided and so forth. So I feel very passionately in the importance of open debate and discussion, and somehow depersonalizing it so it doesn't become personal. It is debating issues and ideas and so on. So I do think I am quite passionate about that.
Perfect. Let's switch gears towards research. And the first question in the research segment is, imagine you're stranded in a small village and you're talking to locals in a pub, you're explaining what you do for a living. How do you explain your research to people who don't really or regularly read your papers?
Well, I would say, given that quite a lot of my research has been on alliances and cooperation, cooperative strategy, and so on, that what I do is, to a large extent, promoting our understanding of how firms can add to human well-being through undertaking international trade, FDI, technology transfer, helping development of emerging economies, this kind of thing. And ultimately, you know, that international business, it seems to me, creates a very powerful rationale for peaceful international cooperation. You know, the benefits that businesses find from international cooperation are those benefits which countries should be able to recognize as being beneficial from cooperation. So I think I would say to people, my research is ultimately concerned with with understanding how international business cooperation and other forms of cooperation arising from it can be encouraged. And that includes trying to understand barriers to cooperation, such as unequal power leading to exploitation or corruption, which is becoming a big issue in the study of international business. Nationalistic barriers to trade and investment, political and cultural misunderstandings, if you like, around concepts such as psychic distance and so on. So I don't believe we can actually solve the world's pressing problems without international cooperation, and that businesses, firms have a role to lead the way here. So I think for me, this is how I would really justify the effort one puts into the study of international business from this angle.
What are a few of the omitted variables in IB research, or things that we haven't emphasized enough so far?
Well, if we say omitted factors rather than just variables, I would mention three of them. One is context. The second is small businesses, SMEs. And the third area, I would say, how international business decisions are actually informed and made. And I think these are all phenomena that have been underemphasized in IB research. I mean, you take SMEs, which I've been working on more recently, since, I suppose, the last 10 to 15 years. Of course, they're increasingly becoming engaged in international business through born globals, international new ventures, participating in value chains and so on. And they're important. I mean, in the UK, it apparently SMEs account for approximately 50% of all the revenues generated by business and about 44% of all employment. And yet one finds IB and small business research continue to be largely separate domains. You know, you have international entrepreneurship as a separate domain, to some extent family business studies as a separate domain. And I think this is regrettable. So I think SMEs are an example of an omitted factor, if you like, or at least an underplayed factor in international business work, although this is perhaps changing now. And if you take context as well, I mean, we've had so many protestations about the importance of context in the last 10, 15 years or so. And yet in practice, it continues, I think, to be marginalized in much research. And of course, there's a big challenge here because, you know, how do we take different levels of context, different levels of analysis into account in IB research, the macro, the meso, the micro factors that shape phenomena like internationalization. And this has come home to me in studying, trying to study SME internationalization, where you see all these factors may play a part. So it's all very complex, but it's still not an excuse for marginalizing context, either, you know, not directly trying to assess context in studies, or relegating context, as often happens, to control variables, dummy variables. So you have a dummy variable for manufacturing versus service industry, or a dummy variable for developing versus developed economies, whatever the case may be.
I understand.
I think
Now, I want to get into the second part of the thrust in research segments about creativity. Where does your creativity come from, and what does your mind think of when it wanders freely in a state of idle curiosity?
Well, I've always liked a notion that the sociologist C. Wright Mills put forward, what he called the sociological imagination, which means, I think he meant applying imaginative thought to asking and answering questions, and stepping back from a situation and thinking outside the confines of existing theory or a narrow theory. So you're envisaging new connections and possibilities, and you're also looking over the fence to some extent across areas of study or disciplines. I mean, this is exactly how this notion of strategic choice came about, that I put forward quite early in my career, because all I was doing was looking over, I was an organization student at the time, but I looked over the fence at strategic management perspectives. And I was also motivated by the personal experience I'd had working for a company called Rolls-Royce and observing how business decisions were actually made. And so this notion of strategic choice, which some people seem to have found quite useful, simply came about through looking outside the box. And I think this is where a lot of creativity comes from. I've personally never been a creative person in the sense of thinking anything new, but I am interested in putting together what already exists, perhaps in new ways. And in that sense, thinking outside the box. So I think for me, it's come about through being willing to look over the fence at other perspectives, other ways of looking at things, and trying to put them together, because they all contribute to making sense ultimately of the world and of what we're studying.
John, where do you see the IB research in the next 5 to 10 years? What is the next big question that we are going to address?
Well, I suppose I would start by thinking of the really existential threats that we now face in the world: global warming, environmental degradation, conflict and extremism, pandemic, whatever you like. And to me, the most important question for IB research is to investigate how business can contribute to addressing such threats. And for example, does this require international business ecosystems based on cooperation between business and public organizations? Can we reconcile moral and political and social expectations of international business with economic interests and the hitherto dominant economic perspectives we've applied? So I see an important role, potential role for multinationals, and including smaller multinationals as well, micro multinationals, to help bring nations together to tackle these problems. And I don't see how else they're going to be tackled. And there are important research opportunities to see how this is already starting to be done in areas like reducing carbon emissions and in the private-public ecosystems that are now developing around renewable power sources like hydrogen. I'm hoping I'm going to have an opportunity to study one of these ecosystems, because a very good friend of mine, a former doctoral student, is very heavily involved in this in China. But these are not only private, public ecosystems, but they're involving international players. Probably these big problems cannot really be solved except through these large systems of cooperation. So I see this as a very important area, emerging area for IB research looking forward.
I would like to follow up on the concept, IB ecosystems concept, with the following question. How did the culture of IB research, IB scholars or scholarship change over the years? And is this a fruitful evolution? What did we lose along the way? What did we gain? How do you see this evolution taking place?
Yes, that's a big question. I see it as having evolved to some extent, regrettably, from a broader, fairly holistic view to a more fragmented set of narrow perspectives. And what I mean is evolving from perhaps what you might say a broad political and behavioral view, for example, of the international firm. And I'm thinking of the work of people like Ray Vernon or Edith Penrose, or even Syatt and March with the behavioral theory of the firm, to quite a heavy concentration on rather narrower perspectives. And I would even say transaction cost economics would be an example of this, although, you know, it's a powerful perspective. And also methodologically, there's been an evolution, I think. One can understand why, towards heavier reliance on data sets. But these restrict the scope of theories that theory testing to data that are available, and they're normally collected for other purposes. So we have quite a heavy use in a lot of research of surrogate indicators. We have a stretching of empirical evidence to the point where it's being used for purposes that are quite distant from its original purposes when the data was collected to form a data set. So it runs a risk of losing meaning and validity. So overall, I think, yes, we have a richness of theories, a tremendous richness of theories, but they are fragmented, and that is a bit of a loss. And, and also, in order to maybe to some extent meet the demands of journals and so forth, we are also not only moving away from a holistic view, but we're in danger often of moving away from the situations that we aim to study through using data that is very much, in a sense, secondhand and in danger of removing us from those situations. I'm not sure I'm making myself very clear, but these are ways in which I've seen the subject evolve over time. And I think I'm not the only person who's concerned about some of these developments.
In some of the interviews, this is coming up, and people are saying, you know, data is driving the research questions right now, and it is setting the agenda, which you're
Yeah.
mentioning the same way. For the sake of time, John, what was the best advice you received when you were a student?
Well, I was, yes, this was applied to my undergraduate studies, but perhaps most particularly my PhD studies. I was supervised by a sociologist who himself had trained as a historian, a man called John Goldthorpe. He later ended up as a professor at Oxford, but this was he was a lecturer at Cambridge at the time. And he was very insistent on paying very careful attention to one's sources and data. Part of my PhD was historical, so it involved going back to original sources and documents and so on. It was looking at the evolution of management thinking in Britain. But one of the other lessons, which is just as important in a way, came through my experience, because I was in the economics faculty at Cambridge. They had started to take sociological studies on board. There was a lot of tension because many economists didn't like this development, and later on sociology became separate in Cambridge, separate faculty. And so there were only three of us. This was the whole doctoral program in sociology within the economics faculty, and we were all studying quite different things. So it was a pretty lonely experience. My supervisor, this is equivalent to committee chair, but in Britain, you just had one supervisor at that time rather than a set of advisors. He unfortunately had to take up a senior administrative role just after I started my studies. So I hardly ever saw him. He was a bachelor, and I used to catch him by going round to his flat on Saturday morning when he was cooking breakfast. I knew I could actually find him there. So the lesson came from loneliness, not so much social, but intellectual loneliness, not having people who I could really share problems with. And I got quite stressed at this from time to time, particularly when I was having to do the first draft of my thesis, and I had nobody I could really talk to and to say, well, do you think this is nonsense or not? And so what I've learned from this is the importance of opportunities for younger scholars and PhD students to have to work as a collective, to have plenty of opportunities to discuss with others, not just ideas, but to share problems of, undertaking research, dealing with uncertainties and the whole sort of process. So this is, there's two things, as I say. One was the importance of paying attention to original sources, which is why I say I'm a bit suspicious of the use of a lot of data sets. Not least because when I first did work in China, and I went along to enterprises then and asked questions about, for example, how many employees do you have? And they would say to me sometimes, if they were being forthcoming, well, do you want the figure we give to the ministry, or do you want the real figure? And that could deviate by 50%, sometimes. Now, the situation may have improved in China since then. I'm talking about the late 80s. But anyway, the importance of getting as close as possible to the original sources or locations of your data. And secondly, in terms of the context of doing research, to have as much as possible plenty of discussion, plenty of other people you can share your experience with, rather than being on one's own. I really was quite lonely, I must say. Not in terms of not having friends, but lonely intellectually because of circumstances. And that's been an abiding lesson to make sure that students are not put in that position.
There's a benefit in growing as a cohort, and the village taking care of their new ones. What are the major pitfalls to avoid for young scholars?
Major pitfalls?
Yeah.
Well, of course, I mean, I don't think I would start an academic career again, because I think it has become so, I mean, this is the British situation. I don't know how much it applies in the States. I believe it does. The pressures to satisfy performance metrics and so on in terms of publication, in some respects also the over valuing, I think, of publishing journal articles as opposed to books. Now, this is something else drummed into me by my supervisor, because being a sociologist come historian, for him, books were the medium for publication. And this fits with my view that I like to have a broader view of things. I was saying earlier that I'm worried about narrow theoretical perspectives. But the trouble is, how do you then do justice to a broader approach to a piece of research? Very often you can only do that within the scope offered you by a book. And for example, if you are trying to understand co-evolutionary processes over time, and I did some work a few years ago, I was very lucky to have access to longitudinal data from a joint venture in China, between Hutchinson and Chinese port authorities, which became the major container port in China. And I had the opportunity to not only look at documentation over time, I had a very keen support of the then chief executive, who himself had got 2 master's degrees and later on went on to do a PhD. So he believed in the value of research. And an awful lot came out of this, but it was very difficult to express this within the confines of a journal article. We did write 1 or 2 articles, but basically it required a book, which did appear eventually. So I think it is very difficult for younger scholars. They are straitjacketed. They're put under a lot of pressure. And in Britain, at least as well, the system has become very bureaucratic and in some ways dysfunctional. So I think it's a very, very tough road to embark on. And I don't know if I started again, what else I would do. Maybe I couldn't find anything else to do, but I would. It wouldn't be as easy as I had it starting off. It's a totally different world. True. Which is a pity, because you lose certain freedoms, including, if you're going to have the freedom to discuss and reflect and so forth, obviously this takes time. And if you're under pressure to produce the next article within the next 2 months and so forth, you don't always, and if you feel sometimes you're competing with others, sometimes over the use of the same data or whatever it may be, you don't have that freedom, to indulge in reflection and discussion and so on, which ultimately enlarges the mind and enlarges the, it increases the value probably of what you can contribute in terms of scholarship.
For the sake of time, last question. What is one question I should have asked you but didn't?
Well, you may have touched on this to some extent, but I think a question that you could have asked was, well, you did ask about the future of IB research, and what I have in mind is the kind of big issue that IB has to address now. And I'm looking at this in the context of debate about the future of capitalism, the questioning of the purpose of business. Even some senior executives are talking about repurposing business and so on. Some of it's to do with, moving towards a stakeholder view of business purpose. So the question then would be, what is the future of IB in these circumstances? How can IB scholars contribute to this debate? And it involves questions like, who ultimately controls international business? To what extent should international business be regulated? do IB scholars need to join forces with colleagues who work in other areas such as corporate governance and organization theory to really deal with this big issue? But I think it's a big issue because it's to do with the possible fundamental change in the system of business, in the nature of capitalism. Not to say capitalism is going to be abolished, but there's a lot of pressure now arising from problems like inequality in society and so on, and the relation between developed and developing countries, and the role of international business and large companies in all this. So I would say this is, I think you did, to be fair to you, I think you did partly invite me to answer that sort of question. But anyway, that's a big question, I think.
Perfect. John, thank you so much for your time for this great and candid conversation. I learned a lot. I'm sure others will agree with me. This was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I enjoyed it. I think I've learned something from it, from the experience. Thank you.